Good afternoon and welcome to Values-Led Leadership for Change, the final event in the Survival to Sustainability series and the very final event in the Rebuilding Heritage programme. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Rebuilding Heritage programme, which is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund under their Business Support programme. I'm Vanessa Moore, Engagement Officer for the programme. So first off, a little bit of housekeeping. As audience members on today's sessions, your cameras and microphones will be switched off throughout the session. The chat function is open today, so please do feel free to say hello, to interact with your fellow attendees, and also, of course, let us know about any tech issues. If you're posting messages in the chat, do make sure to have your chat set to all panelists and attendees if you want to share your message with the whole group. So there's a drop-down menu just above where you type to where you can change your settings. Please pop your questions in the Q&A box. So we'll be starting with presentations from our speakers today, but then you'll have the opportunity to pose your questions and for them to respond later on in the session. Finally, this session is being recorded and it will be made available on our website afterwards. So before we move on to the session itself, a little bit about our programme. So the Rebuilding Heritage programme provides training and support for the sector to help heritage professionals and heritage organisations respond to the challenges of COVID-19. We're offering free resources, such as today's session, and we also have support through one-to-one consultancy sessions and group training offers. This event is the final event of the programme, and we have also now closed our final round of applications for dedicated support. However, this does not mean that we're disappearing for good. All of our resources and recordings of our live events will continue to be available via the programme website. You'll be able to find them at www.rebuildingHeritage.org.uk/resources. We will also be returning in the autumn to share some final insights and learnings from the programme. So please do keep an eye on the website and our Twitter channels for details of our forthcoming knowledge sharing programme. Now, onto the session itself. So our session today, Values-Led Leadership for Change, is presented today thanks to our partners at Claw Leadership, and we have a panel of 3 fantastic leaders who will be sharing some insights from their personal experience of leading through change. First up, I'd like to introduce you to our facilitator to the day, Amanda Smethurst. Amanda is a Claw Leadership Associate. She's an independent consultant, coach and facilitator with a particular focus on organisational development and strategic planning within the cultural sector. I'd like to hand over now to you, Amanda, to talk us through the session and to introduce our panellists.
Huge thanks, Vanessa. It's lovely to be here. This is a subject very close to my heart, so delighted to be with you all this afternoon. As Vanessa said, I'm Amanda Smethurst. I'm a Claw Fellow, Claw Associate and many other things, and your host for this webinar this afternoon. And a huge thanks to Rebuilding Heritage and Claw Leadership for making the space for this conversation, because it's a really important one. Change is all around us now, and it has been for a long time, and it is going to continue to be that way, as we know. And understanding why we make decisions in that context is ever more important. Knowing and recognising what our values are really matters at the moment. They can be an anchor in choppy waters. I like that kind of image of something that holds us steady, as well as something that you can trust when you're making difficult decisions, as well as looking at opportunities and ways of change. And they can help you make some of those really, really tricky calls that we all have to make sometimes. So it's a critical thing as we look at change and think about change to understand what holds us true in that context. This is really important now. Change is around us daily, hourly in some cases. And how do we lead well in this context of ever kind of shifting sands at the moment? What holds us true when there are conflicting demands? And the webinar today creates a space of sharing some perspectives, some insights, and some issues around this, all through the lenses of 3 different leaders who are really experienced in leading through change. So within this webinar, you're going to shortly hear from 3 panellists who you can see in front of you. So Sarah Robertson, who's Communications and Special Projects Director at Bristol Beacon. James Blake, who's the Chief Executive of the Youth Hostels Association. And JC Niala, who's Keeper of the Anthropology and African Collections Researcher and Coordinator of the Rebuilding Trust Project at Horniman Museum. And through their talks and provocations, our panellists will be exploring interesting case studies and key questions for leaders in museums and galleries. We also hope to hear some top tips and learnings of their recent experiences too, and I'm sure that will be peppered through this afternoon. Once we've heard from our three panellists, we'll then have a conversation here, drawing out some of the thinking around leadership in this practice, thinking about change context. And then there'll be time for questions from all of you from the floor. So please do, as Vanessa said, please do pop your questions in the Q&A box as they occur to you, if you'd like to, or hold them to the end, we don't mind. But we'll try and get through as many as we can in the Q&A section of this afternoon. I think that's all I need to say by way of an intro. So the most important thing this afternoon is to hear from our panellists and then to create the space for those conversations. So I'm delighted that our three panellists are joining us who all bring significant experience of leading through change and drawing on their values alongside that experience of being a leader. They're sharing their thoughts and perspectives through three different lenses, three very different examples of work and practice, as I said, and we hope that you'll draw something from each of those conversations. Everyone's been asked to speak for around 12 minutes on their differing approaches and their differing experiences. And as I said, if you have questions that occur to you as you hear the presentations, then please do pop them in the box and we'll come to them later. First up then, I'm going to introduce Sarah Robertson, who is, as I said, the Communications and Special Project Director for Bristol Beacon. And for those of you unfamiliar with Bristol Beacon, it's a live music venue and home to the Bristol Music Trust. And in 2020, it underwent a name change away from Colston Hall, so named after Edward Colston, the slave trader. Many of us will be familiar with that story through media and press around Edward Colston as well. But Sarah, huge welcome to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Amanda. Hi, everyone. Right, I'm going to share my screen. I've done an offering to the gods of tech, so I'm hoping that it is going to work. Right, can you see my screen? Great. My transitions have been a bit laggy, so if that happens, just bear with me and I'm going to stay calm as well. So, I'm here today to talk about my experience of leadership and how you manage yourself, your teams, and your organisation in times of change. My concert hall has been at the centre of a hugely challenging change process, initially moving into the space with caution, fear, and trepidation, and now wholeheartedly and full of commitment. I'm going to give you an overview of our position and how we made the decision to act, give an insight into what change felt like to us, the coping mechanisms we employed to get through it, and how this has changed our organisation and me as a leader. And you don't get much more current and controversial as the rethinking of narratives around colonialism and neglected histories. Our situation is at the heart of this discourse. Our concert hall in Bristol was named after the slave trader Edward Colston, and it took us a long time to get comfortable with the idea that the issue of retaining or removing this name was ours to deal with. We felt helpless and overwhelmed. We were not academics or historians. We didn't feel like we fully understood the huge nuances of the history of the transatlantic slave trade in Bristol, yet we were bearing the issue and the narrative for the city. We were stuck in the middle of polarised opinion. Readers of our local newspaper voted 2-1 to keep the name, but at the same time, we were under huge pressure from activist groups to act. They were regularly protesting outside our building and mounted an effective national press campaign demanding change. The writer and historian David Olusoga said at the time, "The memory of Colston has become the front line in a battle for Bristol's historical soul." This was big, scary, important stuff. So what changed and made us act? For us, it was the little things. For us, it was the little things that started to add up to create an unavoidable need for change, what I call our burning platform. The constant protests were starting to damage our brand. We wanted national newspaper articles about what was on our stages, not the name above our door. More than this, a long-serving and valued member of our staff team who is of African and Caribbean heritage told us that some of her family members wouldn't come to the hall, her place of work, because of the name. We realised that by not acting, we were complicit in perpetuating structural racism. Having the name of a slave trader on the side of our building was telling our communities of colour that their feelings didn't matter to us. It communicated that we were prepared to give up the chance to create meaningful connections with them because we were frightened of making change. We had a duty to our city audiences and our organisation to stop hand-wringing, stop being scared, and get on and deal with it. So the decision was made. But what did making this change feel like? At times, it was petrifying. When we announced that we were changing our name, we were subject to an overwhelming barrage of negative letters, tweets, and press articles telling us that we were doing the wrong thing. It felt lonely. We were ahead of the curve with this decision. Other organisations with skin in the game in the city stepped back to let us deal with the fallout because it was so controversial. In fact, this is a key learning for me in this process. Our heads were so down dealing with this as best we could that we didn't do enough looking up and out, getting allies on board and working to gain support. But as we became more comfortable in owning our position and responsibility, I can honestly say that we were able to create a positive mindset within the team that transformed the process from one that was frightening and high stakes into something that was exciting and central to our organisation moving forward. Again, there wasn't a light bulb moment where everything fell into place and instantly felt better. It was a slow burn of action and realisation that built together over time to create a confident whole. First, we had to zoom out and think of the bigger picture. We thought about how the world will look once we were under a different name. How will it feel to us and our audiences? Crucially, we thought about what making the change would free us up and our audiences to do. For us, freedom meant openness, dialogue, opportunity, honesty, and joy. And suddenly, by reframing this task into positive words of progression and hope, the undertaking felt much more manageable and necessary. This is how you bring people with you and galvanize support, by selling a compelling vision of what will be and setting out how you're going to get there together. We made ourselves look out at others rather than inwards to ourselves and the weight of the issue. When I look back at the comms we produced at the time, we sounded defensive and talked a lot about the changes it will make to our organisation. Now I know it's not about us, but the audiences and the artists we serve. What will the change mean to them? By working on our key values as a staff team, we took it back to the essence of the change, to bring unity, music, and joy to everyone. Who doesn't want to act and make this happen? It was our rallying cry. Crucially, we spent a lot of time thinking about action. How could we signify our change and show that we were making progress? We created a core document called our Transformation Promise, a manifesto for change, for the changes we were going to make across the organisation to become more equitable and inclusive, including ambitious targets around the makeup of our workforce and the diversity of the artists on our stages. The threads of this promise are now the underpinning structure of our business plan. We are asking our audiences to hold us to account on these promises and are publishing regular updates on how we're moving forward. Especially important in our context here today, I believe that smaller organisations have an advantage over larger ones when thinking about and moving into action. Being more nimble, we can identify ways we can be doing better, bring them together into a coherent whole, and go on and get them done without having a long chain of sign-offs or approvals. Our transformation promise involved people at all levels of our organisation, so everyone was bought in and could see the impact it would have on their area of work. We are committed together to achieve what we said we would within it. We're also doing a much better job at gaining advocacy and support. We're no longer ashamed about going out and asking for help, building alliances and support networks. An example of this is the film we produced to announce our new name. We needed the people of Bristol to help us read lines of a poem, specially written by the city poet Vanessa Kisuule. And I was convinced people wouldn't want to help us. We were too controversial. It was a risk to take part. People wouldn't trust us. And you know what? Every single person we asked to take part said yes. We did have support. All we needed to do with that was ask. And here's the video we created.
Bristol, that brick and that car and that house and that streetlight sobering concrete slabs to restless vista.
Beacon, right, blink twice.
Look up, out and over.
New little paint.
Rhythm switch. Cymbal shimmers and bubbling riff.
Crystal, chaos chrysalis, curled like a treble clef.
Familiar, mysterious.
That song kept under your tongue like a sugar lump.
A beacon, the first gig that took you by the collar. How the lights and the bass boiled over its thin lid.
Everyone sharing a heartbeat.
Bristol, obvious and elusive, myth and mundane.
Surviving the strange, emerging shed of shame and sonorous. A beacon, you
And you, and you, and especially you.
constant tapper of tables and kneecaps.
Come bless this place with graceless noise.
Bristol, Arhane, because of, in spite of.
In light of,
In full too,
in time with,
in depth to every single one of you.
a beacon, wink of prism, chill of ivory. 2 drumsticks in a kid's hands.
Galaxies exhaling with an arc of an arm.
Drum roll.
Held breath. New name.
Bristol, beacon.
It's time.
Great. I want to finish by talking about how you cope personally in times of change and challenge. I think you have to work hard to sell yourself the big vision as well as others. Think of the end result and how you will have freed yourself up to be better and stronger. Then think about how you will feel if you carry on as normal. We all want to be fulfilled and make a difference, put in place a brighter future for our children. What is our part to play in this? I often think, if not me, then who? And it spurs me to get on with it. I talked to you earlier about changing your mindset around an issue, changing it to feel like a positive change rather than a mountain to overcome. Adrienne Marie Brown, whose book Emergent Strategy is wonderful on change, activism, and personal resilience, says we need to practice increasing our ease with change. And one of the ways to do this is to embrace pleasure. She calls this pleasure activism. Can you remember a time when you felt like you had something under control, you're in the zone, everything is going right? I'm imagining feeling giddy, lighter, like the stars are aligning, and yes, we can do this. Can you create situations where you are thinking and acting in this pleasurable way more of the time? For me, it's when I'm with my team, batting a problem around, turning it over and seeing what sticks. I enjoy the challenge of finding a way through with this engaging group of people, so I try to work this way as much as possible. What ways work for you? And I've learned that nothing needs to be forever. An action learning mindset works for me, trying things out, making adjustments and trying again. What have you got to lose? As a leader, I'm now always questioning everything. What is our part in this? How does our world work? And is this the right way to thrive? How can we be doing better? Everything I've talked about here is value-led change and leadership in action. My values of fun, teamwork, questioning, taking action, and making a difference have been developed, honed, and magnified by embracing this process. And they are manifesting in how our organisation now functions. Our vision of unity and joy through live music for everyone is being lived across all aspects of our organisation, and we feel more purposeful, united, and happy at work because of it. We have been set free to be our best. So here's my provocation to you. What is your burning platform? What niggling thing is keeping you up at night? Our burning platform was the name, and if we hadn't moved forward and made change, the people of Bristol would have made us act in one way or another, as they did with the Colston statue. What can you be freed up to achieve? Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was really thought-provoking, and that notion of what is your burning platform is a brilliant provocation to leave everyone. I really loved, you talked about so much about feeling as well, and that experience of being within change and the feelings it has on us, because it's not always an easy process, but recognising and acknowledging that I think is really important as well. We can't hide from those things. They're part of who we are as leaders as well. And there's also that notion you said about how do you do the right thing. And I got a real sense of listening to allies and to critics and hearing what people were saying, which helped form that vision that you talk about so strongly. And the notion of pleasure activism, very lovely, very lovely. That's another challenge to us all, another provocation, I think, is where does that sit for us all? So thank you. Thank you. Brilliant way to kick off this afternoon. And I've noticed there's a question in chat as well. We will come to those later, but thank you for popping that in, and a reminder to all of you to keep going with those too. So moving us on to our second speaker, JC. Welcome, JC. So JC is the keeper of the Anthropology and African Collections Researcher and coordinator of the Rebuilding Trust project at Horniman Museum in London. For those of you that have never been, the Horniman Museum and Gardens is an incredible place, one I love very, very much. It's very surprising, it's very family friendly, it's in southeast London's Forest Hill, and it's been open since Victorian times when Frederick John Horniman first opened his house, and the extraordinary collection that he has there to visitors. Very, very magical place. So JC, huge welcome to you this afternoon to talk about the Rethinking and Relationships project. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all so much for taking time to listen to what I have to say today. So I'm going to talk specifically about rethinking relationships and building trust around African collections. It's a project with a long title, and it began in 2019 in the wake of a report that some of you may have heard about, the Savoy report, where President Macron commissioned a report as to what should happen to African collections. And this sent shockwaves through the museum sector because the report raised very strongly the issue of repatriation. And various museums around Europe started to think about their own African collections and what to do. And so from the outset, this was a project that was taking place very much in the public eye. People wanted to know what exactly was going to happen and what were people in the sector thinking about the issues of repatriation. So I was working across 4 museums, the Horniman Museum that we've already heard, MAA in Cambridge, Pitt Rivers in Oxford, and World Museum in Liverpool. And they're all governed differently. There's some university museums are national, they're all very different museums, and they all have significant African collections. So I started off the project actually very much following values that I've always had, which are around collaboration. And we had community members from the African continent, Maasai people from Kenya and Tanzania, who came over to visit the collections. And the idea was, together with community members, we would think through what the best approach should be about how to treat these futures. This was 2019, everything in the world looked bright and positive, and we had no idea what was to come. When the elders and community leaders visited, there was a methodology I had developed around Provenance Research, which I worked with them to see if the ways in which I was approaching the collections matched up to their oral histories. This was something that was relatively unusual, actually, in the museum sector. What tends to happen is that provenance tend to be focused on collectors and information that was already held within the archives, whereas I turned it on its head and said, at the end of the day, these are the people whose material cultural heritage it is. At the very least, what should be treated equally is what their oral histories tell us and what their experiences tell us to speak to the collections. Because we must remember that what we're doing is caring for them, but we're certainly not the experts on them. Leading from that, I'd arranged for a big summit that was meant to happen in June 2020. These community leaders were meant to join us, but also over 100 community members, diaspora community members, people who worked in the heritage sector, creatives, all sorts of people who had an interest were going to come to the Horniman, and we were going to discuss, and many of these people would have never been in the same room this was the first time they were going to experience each other, discuss what is the best way forward with these collections. I'm talking about African collections, but we must remember that Caribbean peoples are also involved in African collections because of their history and where their ancestors originally came from. So it felt to me that it was very important for all of us to be in the room together, which is actually some of my practice. I often ask the question, if I'm in any situation, who is in the room? And that leads you to realize who is not in the room. And even more important is who is at the table and taking part in the conversation. Then, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic happened, as we know, and that summit was no longer going to be possible. And this is when I found that in change, actually, interestingly enough, it is by hanging on to the very values that we had prior to the change that will allow us to navigate it. I remember the precise moment when we got together as the 4 museums and people asked, will this project be able to continue? And I did what I often do, which is I said yes, even though I had no idea how it was going to continue. And that would be one of my provocations as to you. As leaders, we must say yes before we're ready, because people are looking for somebody in times of change to take responsibility. And once you have said yes, suddenly I felt the temperature change in the Zoom room. Everybody sighed because there was somebody willing to take responsibility, which meant that it would go on. But once you have that responsibility, you don't have to have all the answers. And in terms of collaboration, what I did was I said, well, let's look and talk to the people who these collections matter to hugely. Diaspora community members and community members on the continent. The 2 countries that we were working with were Kenya and Nigeria. And I got in touch with people on the ground there and said, let's make this work. How can we make it work? And so they went and spoke to people in their communities, and everybody said what they wanted was access to the collections. So I came back to the museums and I said, well, there's been 10, 15 years spent digitizing collections. What we need to do is work with community members all across the African continent through the digital collections. All that we have to do is remove the barriers to access, which will also enable people to think more deeply about what the future of those collections should be. What that meant, practically speaking, was making sure there was things like internet access for people who were going to work with them. But it also ended up with one of the things that I feel, in terms of the collaboration with the people I worked with, we're the most proud of. We developed a toolkit that supported community members to be able to work with collections online. In the museum sector, we use very particular language, accession numbers, objects, places, all of these things which community members, when they're looking at collections online, may not have been able to understand. Many of them will have never entered these museums. They won't understand museum protocol. And so I decided to learn from the communities that I was working with. In Kiswahili, there's a wonderful word called sindikiza, which means to escort. And what this comes from is when you have a guest visiting you in your home, you walk them to the car. You can't say goodbye at your door. If they visited you walking, sometimes the awkward situations happens where you walk them back to almost their house because you're escorting them, and then they escort you back, and you can imagine what carries on. And I thought what we need to do with this toolkit is sindikiza our community members into the museum via the digital collections. The toolkit contained within it personal videos and invitations from curators saying, please come and work with these collections. This is how you need to get in touch with me. If you email me and haven't heard from me for 2 weeks, this is why. And another value which I believe in strongly is transparency. We need to talk to the people we engage with about the challenges we're facing. Nobody was expecting us to be perfect, even before the pandemic, and certainly not during it. But by unpacking museum processes, what it allowed was for an equitable conversation to be able to carry out between community members, between museum staff themselves, and with those who had an interest in the collections and wanted to work with them and think about their futures. And so with the use of the toolkit, it meant that over the period of about, in total, it ended up being about 6 months, there was over 92 community members who carried out research and provenance research on these collections split between Kenya and Nigeria. That was a huge number of people, considering that each community member was working with 15 objects. So the number of objects that have now been researched and had their stories told, or to use the word of a Nigerian community member, have been uplifted by this process, was something I could not have fathomed at the outset of this project. I'm going to summarize now really by saying what I learned from the process, and by working with a complete amount of trust that the answers would come if we saw each other as people to work with, and saw each other as people that we can learn from, knowing that there was a leadership that was willing to take a certain amount of responsibility for the process as it occurred. The thing that I learned is that experimentation is one of the most important values and things that can come out of crisis. People were just happy that the project was going on. We tend to lean towards the conservative when change arises, because we think that if we then challenge ourselves further, then our mistakes will be highlighted even more. But actually, during processes of change, ironically, sometimes there's even less that can go wrong, because nobody knows actually what any of the answers could or should be. I will also reflect on what Sarah said about pleasure. My personal thing is about joy as resistance. And I think that there's something to be tapped in through any small moment that happens, thinking about that moment of joy. I will never forget the first workshop. So we did all of the preparatory work. We had made sure that people had access to data in Kenya and Nigeria. We'd made sure that they had all the technology they needed. We had collaboratively created the toolkit. And I got onto the Zoom room early, and I had no idea if anybody was going to turn up. And I remember the first person who turned up had also arrived early, because she said she also had no idea whether anybody was going to turn up. Because while I had been thinking about the situation in the UK, I'd forgotten that also in Nigeria and Kenya, people were in lockdown. So everybody was getting onto the Zoom room from their own individual homes. We were all alone, but we were also coming together. And the next thing I knew, I had a screen full of faces I had never seen before, but also people who I got to know and become very close with, and who became collaborators and great friends over the coming months. So I'm going to stop now because I've taken up a lot of your time already. I think the final provocation I will leave you with is, what is your big picture? My big picture was very simple. This project had to go on, come what may. And to borrow again from the word of community members, there's a Kenyan expression that says, there is no otherwise. If you give yourself very little room to maneuver, you will have to make do with it. And that's what I decided to do. The toolkit has now gone on to be used in other museums and by historic houses and people who would like to open up African collections, even places as far-flung as Canada and other parts of North America. I'm really here just to encourage you to look for the places where there is no otherwise, and find that resistance and joy to carry you to a place that you could have never imagined. Thank you.
Thank you, JC. Thank you. That's such a lovely message to leave us with, that resistance and joy to carry you to a place you wouldn't have been otherwise. Really lovely message. And I loved as well you're thinking about who's at the table and the obvious care that you took throughout that change to create that space for people to be at the table, actively engaged in what you were thinking about, and how you're explicitly clear about those values throughout that sit within all of the work you do, and how that enables what you do to happen, especially that the notion of experimentation coming out of crisis, that sense of taking risks and trusting that taking risks is the right way to go as well, because that's a leap of faith sometimes too, which requires that sense of trusting yourself to be able to dive in so deeply. So hugely thank you for that. Final speaker today who's with us is James. James is the Chief Exec of the Youth Hostels Association, which I'm sure needs no introduction. Is a well-known and well-established history of providing accommodation for travellers, but obviously the pandemic threw some curveballs at you, and created a space for change in terms of looking at new commercial and other models, ways of working essentially, So a massive welcome, James, to hear another example through another lens.
Great, thank you, Amanda. I'm going to try and share my screen too, so hopefully this will work. So can people see that? Okay, somebody give me a nod. Yeah, great. Okay, so as you say, Amanda, what I'm going to try and do is pick up some themes from YHA, a different organisation to the two you've just heard about, but I hope some common themes coming out. And I've got loads of questions actually for JC and Sarah, but I'll have to hold those back. So I'll say a little bit about us, a little bit about the impact that COVID has had on us and the effect it had on the leadership approach that we've taken and are still taking, of course, because we're still not over, and try and tease out some of the learning, which we can perhaps pick up in the discussion, if that's all right. So hopefully that will move on. So we've been around, as you say, hopefully many people will be familiar with us, but we've been around for just over 90 years. In fact, our 90th birthday was in April 2020, so that was an interesting birthday present we had last year. Our charitable object is on the slide. That's the original wording. It's perhaps a little bit dated now, but fundamentally still highly relevant. And given the lockdowns and the lack of access, particularly for young people, to the countryside, green spaces and culture and heritage, I think even more important now than it's ever been. What does that mean we do in practice? We're a national charity, particular focus on young people. I guess our key message is that where you go changes who you become. And through that, we hope to improve physical and mental health and well-being, life skills, mainly through residentials, from overnight stays, but through those to connect people with nature and heritage. And as I say, a particular focus on disadvantaged young people. How do we deliver that? We have a network of over 150 youth hostels across England and Wales, spread right around cities, countryside, and coast. And as you can see from the map there, just quite a preponderance in sort of national parks and other places, but as well as the core cities across the England and Wales. And of course, we have the most amazing range of buildings and locations, and I've put 4 of them on this slide just to give you a flavour. Hopefully some of you will have seen or visited these. Top left is Ilham Hall near Dovedale, where the youth hostel is within a National Trust stately home. Top right is Medieval Castle at St Breville's in the Wye Valley, where we leased that from English Heritage. Bottom left is Wilderhope Manor. It's an Elizabethan manor in Shropshire, just near Church Stretton. Bottom right is Whitby, our hostel in Whitby, right next to the Abbey. The hostel's on the left. And we've got many more examples of that. And so I suppose the point being that as well as trying to enable access for people who might otherwise not be able to stay to places and be able to see amazing cultural and heritage attractions, we are actually within them in what we do as well. So I guess one thing to say about YHA is we've always been a social enterprise, a charity reliant on trading for the majority of our income. I think it was our first chair who said in 1930 that doing good requires doing well. Unless we can operate viably, we can't meet our charitable object. We've got significant scale. You can see the numbers on the slide there, but around about 1 million people a year stay with us. About just over 40% of those are young people under 26. And of that, quite a high proportion of school trips across both primary and secondary, with a significant number of those schools being disadvantaged schools in the Department for Education list. And I suppose a real focus for us before we hit the pandemic was ensuring we had a commercially savvy and successful operating model, recognising that while we're a charity, we're working in sectors such as the young people sector and also the effectively budget accommodation sector, where you've got pretty savvy commercial operators. So we did a lot of work around modernising our processes and systems, taking the tough decisions in our estate, putting in a much more commercial trading approach. So things like dynamic pricing, so your price varies by time, by season, and by location, and ensuring that we had on the senior team a set of people on the exec with skills from very different sectors. And I suppose, but also having done all that, and you can see in the graph in the bottom left, that's been pretty successful up until the pandemic year. We were growing our reach and our income year on year, but ensuring that we didn't lose our sense of purpose. And it was just perhaps when I arrived about 4 years ago, just a slight sense that we'd had our best commercial year ever, but we just lost touch a bit with what we were ultimately there to do. So before the pandemic hit, the key piece of work I was involved in was developing and launching our new strategy. And fundamentally, that was about putting us back on the map as a leading national charity for young people operating across the youth, environment and heritage sectors. What you can see on the screen there is our vision for the future. You know, everyone has access to the benefits of adventure for the first time and a lifetime, and a longer description there around every child being able in 10 years' time to stay away from home, travel, experience adventure and access outdoors, nature, culture and heritage. Obviously not a vision that we can achieve completely ourselves, and so right at the heart of what our strategy was about was collaboration to do that. We refreshed our mission and our values, and again you see in that, I think, an emphasis on collaboration and authenticity, which I'll come back to a little bit later. So that was our new strategy, which was trying to, if you like, combine the best of being commercial, but also having a really core sense of purpose. And then came COVID, the most severe and significant crisis ever to hit the YHA. The graph there basically shows the difference between our budget and what actually happened over the financial year 2020 to 2021. So, you know, you can see the blue bars are what happened before the pandemic, the red bars what happened last year. So the first graph there is the income. We lost 80% of our revenue last year. It's about £40 million, reflecting restrictions on hostels. They were closed for much of the year, but also just ongoing difficulties in what's core to youth hosteling, which is about shared spaces and bringing people together. And obviously then, even when we could open hostels, the things that people come to see, indeed many heritage and cultural locations, as you'll know, were not open for long periods of time. We've had very few groups. School trips have been banned for much of the last year, and we've got no international visitors. So, you know, it's been challenging. We've managed to reduce costs, take advantage of grants, furlough, all of those things. So our costs reduced last year by 29 million, but we're still left with an £11 million loss last year. This year, I think things are better in the sense that the red bar on the left there, our income is twice as much as it was in the first year, but it's still 60% less than it was pre-pandemic. So we're still expecting, with less government support, a similar level of loss this year. So it's still very much live for us, as I'm sure it will be for many of you. Okay, so how do we respond in leadership terms? I mean, I think first, we put in place pretty quickly an emergency decision-making process at our board, exec and operational level. You know, we had to close the whole YHA network down for the first time in our history, literally overnight. But more importantly, I think what we did is, and you see this on the graph I've put on the slide, we established basically an 18-month framework really early on to manage through the pandemic, and it's largely guided us ever since, and it's summarised on the slide. And I suppose what's been helpful is almost whatever's been thrown at us, we've had some kind of framework, and broadly this framework has held good for us. And just to pick out a couple of points, I mean, the first thing is to say on the left there that our strategy and our focus as a charity and our cash flow and financial position have been the two guiding lights, if you like, through that. So we've had to make decisions. We've looked at both of those, and not just our finances, but our strategy too. So I think, as it was Sarah might have been saying, you know, I think keeping your strategy constant in a time of change really important to us. And then we've had basically 4 phases of work, and the timings of those have changed as things have changed around us, but it's worked as a framework. So we had the close down, trying to do that quickly and safely. We then had repurpose. Well, we can't open youth hostels as we normally do, but what other purposes can hostels be used for? We were really pleased that we were able to repurpose our youth hostels, including the hostel in Bristol, for example, to support government work, whether it's for key workers, for the homeless, for those escaping from domestic violence and other purposes. And actually that's opened up new opportunities for us longer term, as well as in the pandemic, as well as giving a little bit of income to us in kind of tough times. The M&M have what we called our Reboot project. We've actually, I think, rebooted 3 or 4 times now as the pandemic's gone on. But fundamentally, well, given COVID, how can we make the best of it? What is our operating model and our commercial strategy in a COVID environment? We can't, for example, operate dormitories in the way we would normally do. So how can we operate rooms in a different way? How can we operate more rooms outside our hostels as well as inside our hostels? Those sorts of things. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, right from the word go in April last year, we saw that there was a long-term opportunity for renewal. So that's the fourth piece. Basically putting in place what would be a basis for long-term survival and renewal. So that's partly about recovery from the pandemic, but it's also spotting the opportunity to completely reinvent our operating model, our network, which hostels we have where, and the central support that we need to deliver that. And I guess we knew that we needed to do that anyway to deliver our strategy. And I guess what this was about was using the opportunity of the pandemic as well as the challenge to try and put that in place more quickly. So just finally then, I suppose, just a few personal reflections on leadership, looking back 18 months in. And this is where I think there are some similarities with what JC and Sarah were saying. I think the key thing that we got right, as I say earlier on, and we discussed this with the board, was that our strategy and our values hadn't changed, and in fact were even more important in the pandemic than they were before. That was hugely helpful. So our business plan and our KPIs and our timings were completely out, but where we were trying to get to in 10 years' time hadn't changed, and in fact was even more important. Having that kind of North Star, if you like, I think was really, really helpful to us with decision making. Governance, we always had a pretty strong governance framework. That was tested really hard in this time period. You know, the board suddenly were very worried. They all had different experiences in their own organisations. They thought we wouldn't potentially survive. I suppose the old norms about what's strategic and is in the board space and what's operational and is in the exec space somewhat went out of the window because it was very hard to say if anything wasn't strategic in this period. So I think what that meant was we couldn't rely so much on those. We had to rely on relationships, and particularly the relationship between the chair and me. We'd had some very difficult conversations, but I think that mutual respect there was absolutely critical. I put up there the limits to commerciality because, I mean, I sort of mentioned that we'd been proud of the way that we built our commercial model, and we felt that gave us real resilience around income generation, income diversification that perhaps some other charities didn't have. In fact, I remember talking about it at seminars like this before the pandemic, but suddenly it was a huge weakness in COVID. You know, 80% of our income had gone at a stroke. So actually the fact we were a charity suddenly was critical for generating new sources of income, particularly from government during this period. I think others have talked about burning platforms, and I think that's absolutely true for us as well. I mean, I think the term itself can be, is perhaps a bit clumsy, but I've been really aware that COVID provides the biggest opportunity as well as the biggest crisis in our history. It's given us the opportunity to do things that we would have been nervous about doing before. And I was very struck by what JC just said about experimentation being a kind of core value in a crisis. You know, I think it gives us the ability to make the sort of radical changes to our central cost model, our ways of working, our culture, the size and scale of our estate, the nature of our operating model, and how we embed our purpose. All of that has been up for a review in an environment where people understand why we're having to make radical decisions in the context of change, like with the pandemic. And I suppose also the burning platform to take the difficult decisions on people that you kind of know instinctively are right, but cause significant organizational and sometimes personal pain. But I've never yet made one of those decisions and wished I'd made it later, I guess. Also, just other burning platforms, new opportunities for influence within government, within the media and so on. You know, our crisis was pretty acute and pretty obvious. And also what we were doing is so intimately connected to some of the problems and issues that were coming out of lockdown. You know, how do you deal with 2 million children and young people who have no access to local green space, for example? No access to heritage, so that lost opportunity for a generation. So the opportunity to shape the policy environment, which is in flux, has been perhaps better than they have been for a long time. And I think probably one of the great positives for me coming out of the pandemic has been a sense of more collaboration and less competition in our sectors. You know, we're all facing a common COVID enemy, and I can say a little bit more about that if it's helpful later. And just finally, I guess, that's all great. And those burning platforms are great, but the thing we've really hit up against, and I'm still struggling with a bit, is squaring the circle of all those opportunities, if you like, for long-term renewal, but much less capacity in the context of an exhausted and depleted team. How you deal with that, I think, is a real challenge, because I'm very conscious I have a window of opportunity here. So that's something we're still wrestling with, I would say, at the moment. And then I suppose finally, personally, a lot of learning about how you kind of lead personally. And because, at times, I'm sure you'll all be the same, I'd felt exhausted and depleted too, personal challenges as well as organisational ones. And certainly the biggest challenge to my own personal well-being that I think I've faced in my career. I felt it was very important to be open about that with my chair, with my exec team, on our staff webinars. At the same time, though, recognising that there were limits to that people were looking to me for security, stability, calmness, a sense of optimism. That, yes, we will be there point that JC was making was very much true for us too, even if I didn't always feel that. But that sometimes being able to put the CEO hat on and be able to say that kind of thing, actually, even if I didn't always feel it, could sometimes help me with my well-being and that feeling of purpose too. So I've got lots of learning and, of course, things still going on, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you, James. Again, really, really rich, and picking up many of the themes of Burning Platform and seeing that as an opportunity as well as a kind of catalyst. That notion of the North Star, really heard that very loudly, that the organisation and you know exactly what that North Star is, and holding that really true. So that creates that stability as you move around, as you look at those opportunities. And that kind of comes back into that collaboration and authenticity that you mentioned right at the beginning as well. But a really strong sense of using this as a chance to reimagine an opportunity and to rethink and to kind of create, in a way, the organisation so that it has a future and has that purpose that it was always there to kind of deliver. So thank you. Lots and lots of rich thought. A reminder to all of you listening that if you have questions, please pop them in the Q&A. We're going to come to those in a minute. But before we dive into those, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions of the panelists first. And then we'll hear your questions and dive into those. So please do keep popping them in the Q&A chat for us. So just, you've all talked about values. You've all referenced that really clearly within your presentations. But I just want to kind of step back from that a tiny little bit and just ask you about what you see the key ingredients are for a successful and agile leadership, because you've all talked about how you've had to move and flex and change as well. So how has that worked? What are the things that make that happen for you? What are those successful ingredients? Sarah, can I start with you?
Yeah. So I talked a lot just now about the vision of the future and being able to articulate to yourself and your audiences what the future is going to feel like and how it's going to manifest itself in the things that you're going to do. So to be able to sell that future to people when times are hard. And I've been thinking about it this week, and one of the things that I think it's about having awe, not overwhelm. So being able to take the feelings of panic and nervousness and turn them into kind of the awe of the problem. Like, wow, this is such a knotty, complex thing. How exciting it is to be able to be in a position to get my teeth into this and make a real difference and change. And again, that links back to what I said before about turning things into a positive rather than seeing them as a challenge. And in the moment, that's really hard. And sometimes it takes a bit of stepping back and taking a bit of time out and taking a deep breath and coming at it from a different angle. But that's really helped for me, having that awe of the problem rather than letting it overwhelm me.
Lovely, thanks, Sarah. And JC, what for you are the key ingredients for being agile, successful and agile in your leadership?
I think I'll bounce off what Sarah said. Actually, for me, it's curiosity. I always know I'm running into problems when I don't have questions. So as long as I've got questions and as long as I remain curious about the situation and I remain curious about the people I'm working with and the people around me and curious about the situation, then it's fine, because once you're working with questions, it gives you possibility. Right? So, and I think that's the biggest thing in times of crisis is everyone's looking for that possibility.
I love that notion of curiosity. Really do. It's such an important thing to hold. James, for you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Sarah and JC have just said. Can I pick up something which I think is really important? Again, I think JC mentioned in hers, which is about the ability to be bold and having the confidence to do that in a crisis, because the risk is you become more cautious, and I think that's exactly the moment when you become more bold. And I was very struck. I mean, yeah, I realised quite early on that the one liberating thing about all this was that none of the KPIs or anything that I'd agreed anyone could possibly criticise me for not, who knew what success looked like? I still don't know what a successful year looks like. And once you've got yourself over that, personally, I think then it allows you that scope to try things and accept that not all of them are going to work, but there will be learning in all of them. And I think that, for me, is probably has been the most important thing. And it's as much about convincing yourself as it is about convincing everyone else, I think.
Thanks, James. And alongside that kind of notion of what successful leadership looks like, the biggest challenge, what has been the biggest challenge and what have you learnt from that? So I'm going to go around different orders. JC, can I dive in with you first?
I think, on the one hand, I've talked about being bold, but on the other hand, it's about limits as well.
Yeah.
And the biggest challenge has been feeling your way around your team's limits also, because everybody came, this was a completely new situation for everyone, and being respectful and mindful of and realizing, when is it that actually this situation might just be too much for somebody in the team, and how to best support people within their limits. So that was a really big challenge, because it was also new for everybody, if you take a simple thing like working from home, particularly if we think about people with young children or people with children, depending very much, you can say that, having children at home is a challenge, but it very much depended on what age the children were, for example. So if you've got, the younger they were, the harder it might have been. People who had older children, it might be, less. So it was finding and understanding and being sensitive to, and then responsive to the limits that were placed on people because of this unusual situation.
Yeah, you're right. That challenge of people as humans, isn't it? And how we are with each other within that context. And Sarah, for you as a leader, what are the biggest challenges of kind of leading through change that what would you highlight as the biggest one that you've kind of...
especially in the position that we found ourselves in, for me it was about doubting my legitimacy about being able to move into that space. Like, you kind of spend a bit of time looking around going, surely there's someone more qualified than me to deal with this, because this is huge. So it took a bit of, when I mentioned before about how it took us a bit of time to get comfortable with the fact that it was ours, and personally as well, the fact that it took a bit of time for me to feel comfortable that it was mine. But I think what it has shown me is that I kind of have to learn to trust myself, that it's something, it is what it is, it's here, it's a challenge, you need to get over it. So you kind of need to trust yourself that you can do it, and put your head down and move into that space with humility, and make sure that you kind of speaking to the people who are already in that space. Our situation was so complex and we felt unqualified to deal with it, but we had to kind of approach it from trusting that we kind of knew where we were coming from our point of view, but also with humility for the people who were already taking space up, using space in that area, if any of that makes sense.
No, it does. Trusting self and making space, all of it makes sense. James, for you, what's the biggest challenge and what have you learnt from that about yourself?
Yeah, I think probably the aspects of people relationships are the most challenging, in a context where you can't have the kind of face-to-face dialogue about managing those. I mentioned challenges with the board. I remember when asked at some point, well, anyone in your team who's got experience of losing 80% of their income in a year? Well, many people had people in their team with that kind of experience. So, that sense of flying blind to a certain extent, and the board expecting you to have knowledge you might not have to have. That was challenging at times. We've had to downsize massively as an organisation, including on my exec team, you know, and I've had to have incredibly difficult conversations over Zoom with people, basically saying, I'm sorry that, you know, I don't think, you know, however hard you've worked, you haven't got a future with us. And that has been incredibly difficult, because these are valued colleagues who've tried their heart out, and we just sadly haven't got, you know, the capacity for the future. People have been very understanding about that. I think people, you know, just being honest and open, and having those conversations is difficult. But for somebody, I mean, I really like to do that kind of thing face to face. I found that very hard in this context, and over a long period of time when the separation between work and home is not as good, you know, it can take over you, I think, if you're eat away at you a little bit. And I think that's certainly been my biggest challenge.
Thank you, James. That notion, again, it comes back to people, relationships. It's a thread that's run through everything that you've all said, actually. And the importance of that, the importance of the integrity, the authenticity of those as well. Just a reminder to you all to pop questions in the chat if you have them. We might dive in and answer these two now. At the moment, they're very Bristol specific, Sarah, so I'm looking at you. And then we'll come back to a wider conversation. But please do, if you've got other questions, pop them in the chat for us. That'd be lovely. So Sarah, do you want to pick up those two quickly, and then we'll see what else comes through?
Yeah, so Joanna asked, did Bristol Beacon have any fallout from existing funders during or post transformation? Yes. A lot of the major funders still supported us, but we had a bit of kickback from, I suppose, more kind of individual giving donors. A lot of the kind of the people who support arts organisations in Bristol were very conservative in their outlook, and a lot of those people had were aligned with Colston. It sounds crazy when you talk about it from now, but Colston was a major benefactor to the city. He built schools. He's got a plaque, a window in the cathedral. He was a very prominent person in the city, with links to business and links to big organisations. So we definitely had kickback from some of the more conservative donors in the city, and we spent a lot of time having to get over that. It took us a while. It took us a while when we announced that we were going to change our name in 2017, and we announced what the name was going to be in 2020. During that time, we undertook a huge amount of work, consultation, speaking to people, getting people on our side, a consultation with our audiences, with our staff. So we were busy during that time, but it took us quite a while. And to be honest, it took the events last summer of Black Lives Matter and the activism around that to kind of swing the public opinion in our favour. When the statue came down, it was kind of like, okay, well, it's obvious that you have to change. Why haven't you done it already? And up until that point, it wasn't obvious at all. We were still getting kickback. It's such an interesting, I could have talked to you for an hour about what happened.
And there's another question there from Hannah, which just feeds on to where you were just then, around going against a vote 2 to 1 against changing the name, and how you dealt with going against the majority response, which is an interesting notion for you specifically, Sarah, but also for James and JC, about going something against the grain with a decision.
Yeah.
So Sarah, do you want to answer that first, and we might?
Yeah. So when we announced that we were changing our name in 2017, it was a horrible shock because we were it was overwhelmingly negative. Our Twitter feed was scrolling with people telling us we were doing the wrong thing. They were never going to come to see any shows with us again. They weren't going to donate again. We were taking away their history, etc., etc. And what we had to do was we had to listen to these people. I thought at the time, and I still do, that the backlash against us was never really about the name. It was about the political situation at the time, and the way that we are now, and where people are polarized and people in certain communities don't feel like their voices are being heard. And I think that we were bearing the brunt of that with things like Brexit and in or out, yes or no, Colston or not. And what we had to do is we had to be open and listen to those comments. So we did a huge amount of consultation. We had a roadshow where we went into different areas of our city and invited people to come and talk to us about what we were doing, and we could explain one-to-one about our processes. Sometimes that meant that we were basically inviting ourselves to be shouted at, and that definitely happened. But we also celebrated asked people for their memories of the hall, and we recently had our 150th birthday. And during that time, we asked people for their memories. We were clear that we weren't erasing people's histories or taking people's memories away. They were still gonna carry on. But it's a hard process. Sometimes you just have to plow on and take a bit of the criticism to come out stronger the other side.
Thanks, Sarah. James, your experience of going against the majority?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one. I suppose the first thing to say is, as a charity, we're set up to operate in the public interest, not necessarily in the, what our members think or what the latest survey says. So there is something about, kind of who are you listening to, and how is that view coming forward? I mean, for us, the issue is we've got a set of very loyal members who are now probably an older demographic generally, not a particularly diverse one, and potentially who find change difficult. Losing a hostel, or for example, there'll be a big campaign could come up against it, even if it's the right strategic decision to take. So I think this part of that has been about, well, two or three things. One of that has been about ensuring other voices are louder. So one of the things we've done over the last year in the pandemic is we've set up many people have got this, but a youth advisory team, which is taking a group of young people, effectively our beneficiaries, and giving much kind of louder voice within all aspects of what we do. So with the board, with some of our strategic decision making, and our operations as well. And that's been really helpful because it's given us a direct line to voices that weren't being heard before. So I mean, still work to do on, but I think that's been helpful in balancing out what we're hearing and giving us the confidence sometimes that the decisions we're taking are in the interests of what we're fundamentally set up to do. Our values have been useful. There are times when you can, go back to our values and say, well, look, hold on, this, what we're doing here is in tune with our values, and we just need to have the confidence to see it through, and nobody can criticize you, I think, for that. The only other thing I'd say is that quite a lot of times when we've had opposition, people have thrown our history at us. So they've said, well, you're not being true to your history by doing X, Y, and Z. I actually went and looked at our history. And what was really interesting about it was that what a lot of people thought our history wasn't actually what our history was. We had a radical history of kind of, set up in a time of social reform, and when you look back at that, actually reclaiming that history in a new context was really quite a powerful driver for our strategy. And particularly when I started, people said, well, when I was young, this is what the YHA was doing, you ought to be doing that. And I look back and, well, that might have been what happened in the 1950s, but it wasn't what happened when we were set up in the 1930s, and that's what we need to be inspired by. So I know that won't apply to everybody, but that is something that we found helpful in guiding us forward.
Thanks, James. JC, I'm going to pick up on both some of the things that Sarah and James have said, and also target you towards a slightly different question. But that notion of voices is coming through really, really clearly. Who you ask, who you listen to, how you engage, who you bring in to hear from. And JC, Hannah was asking a question about how your approach of inviting and how you reached out to communities and made that invitation personal and relevant for them to accept. So it's building on that notion that Sarah and James have spoken about as well.
I have to first of all start off by saying that I am still learning how to invite different people. I'm very proud of some of the successes that we've had, but it's still a work in progress because there's always more people one can reach. So I start off with that proviso. The next thing I'll say is I am somehow relatively unusual, not entirely, but in the sense that I am a community member as well as being a heritage professional. So that meant that it brought certain, it was useful in the sense of when I was extending certain invitations, there were I suppose maybe shortcuts of language. And by that, I don't mean, whether it's French or German. I mean, just in terms of understanding what community members might be more tuned to hearing. But also that, I use the term community members, but they're not a homogenous group. So this is where I say I'm still learning. And I'll give an example. We really wanted to hear from Caribbean community elders, particularly ones who are local to the Horniman. Because of course, there are many who've come and visit the Horniman and have done for many years. And because of the way things had progressed in the pandemic, there was a lot of museum sector things that were active on social media, but were not, and it seemed like there was a whole world happening there, but there were many people who were being left out of that conversation. And what I literally had to do was, once again, learn from the people who I wanted to reach and was working with. So I had a series of good old-fashioned telephone conversations with Caribbean community elders, and out of that came a newsletter, actually, that they, many of them said, we still love newsletters, we want to keep in touch, and that's a wonderful way that we would like to be able to keep in touch with you. And I realized that it's about, when you extend that invitation, what is the method in which that invitation will be for the people who need it in a particular way? So that has led us to, diversify the way we reach communities. So some of it has, as I said, for this particular group of Caribbean elders, it's been much more newsletters, phone calls, spending time in a way that maybe we're not used to nowadays. But also using key people in different networks. So for example, on the continent, it was not going to be possible to reach community members who are in rural areas because they're all online, they're all on WhatsApp, but we might not have had that direct link. So by working with younger generations who are based in urban centers, they were then able to contact via WhatsApp grandparents who are upcountry. So it was about, working with people to build on work that they had already done in order to be able to extend those invitations, and crucially in a way that was respectful, in a way that it would be, the community members would be receptive to.
Lovely, thank you, JC. And it's bringing to mind the notion of engagement as well around pre-COVID times, cups of tea, that kind of really personal engagement, so valuable. And now how things are different, because you can't just do that, you can't just have a cup of tea and a conversation with someone. So finding different ways to connect and reach out that feel right, I think, as you say as well, the right ways of connecting and inviting people in are so critical. Thank you.
I just wanted to add one other thing just on that, is also remembering that there's different levels of engagement people want as well. Sometimes it's a one-off, sometimes they want a long-standing engagement, and being respectful of that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And then there's a question here about scale of organisation and whether that makes change easier or quicker. Sarah, there's a thought that you said smaller organisations might make it easier than large organisations. Is that true? And obviously, JC, you work within a complex web of organisations. So it's not just one, it's a network, which is another lens to put on that. So James, is it easier, and your organisation is significant, we know, in scale. How easy is change in an organisation of your scale?
Yeah, I mean, instinct is that it can be more difficult in a large organisation, although there are some things where we have advantages. So I think what can be more difficult is you're up against that kind of, the sort of large oil tanker, if you like, with a lot to it, lots of complexity, and that sort of history that I was just talking about. So, turning the ship round, requires an awful lot of work to do that, lots of different moving parts you've got to align, you've got lots of committees and boards and other things that you've got to go through, and you're not as a leader directly in touch with all of those bits. There's all sorts of things, and everyone with their own views, their own kind of issues, and that convincing people, that sort of magnet, if you like, in that old sort of school physics thing where you have the magnet and all the iron filings aligned to it. Being able to get a strong enough magnet, I think, is perhaps a bit more difficult sometimes in a large national organisation. I think the advantages you've got, well, one having the burning platform, I think, is helpful, and being able to then sort of grab that. The second is capacity. I mean, we do have more capacity, even though I know I've felt short of capacity all the time, but actually we do have more capacity. and the ability to, to bring in the resources to bring in other capacity if we need it. And I think that's helpful. But I guess I haven't had the experience of trying to go through the pandemic in a small organisation, so I'd be interested to hear others.
How was it for you, Sarah? Were you able to be fleet of foot in that smaller organisation?
Yeah, we really were. We were able to get around the table at the beginning when we knew that the problem was becoming too pressing for us to stand back from. When the statue came down in June, we had to really jump to it. We were getting very close to having a new name just before the pandemic hit, and we thought that we might be able to get around a table with everyone else in a few months. So we kind of stopped having those conversations, and then when it became clearer that that wasn't going to happen, then the statue came down, and we realised we just had to get on with it. And we did. We brought people back off furlough. Most of my team were on furlough during that period, and we had to bring them all back. And having that close-knit group of people where we all knew what people's strengths and weaknesses were, and the chain of command wasn't very big. So in our organisation, we don't have far to go to get decisions made. And incidentally, that's one of the things that we could definitely have done better in the process that we did, which is that we had a trade-off between speed and thoroughness. Our consultation process was incredibly thorough. We took our time over it. We spoke to as many people as we could, because we didn't want people to come back and say that their voices weren't heard, that where was their opinion in all of this. And then the statue came down, and we were accused of not acting quickly enough. So I think that there's a trade-off between getting it right and doing it properly, and also getting it done quickly. And I'm not sure that we got that right ultimately. History kind of caught up with us a bit.
Thanks, Sarah. And JC, you work within the Horniman, but as you said, the project works across a network of, a number of museums. So how for you, kind of working on one scale and then that complicated network, how was that creating change, making it happen?
Yeah, there was, because remember, it's a network of museums. I was in the UK, but then there was also the network in Kenya and in Nigeria. So it was, there was quite a lot. I think that there were two things happening in parallel. So on one hand, you have to meet people where they are, because especially if you're not embedded within a particular institution, you're not going to be able to change their systems on how they work. So, I mean, all I can say is I literally had to have lots of physical maps to work with, to remember this is how this is working here. And then, of course, as Sarah mentioned, you have the challenge of furlough as well, that was coming and going. So it was, it was a little bit like, now you see them, now you don't. And so there was that one aspect of it. But then there was also the aspect of being able to bring people together. It's amazing how even in this, kind of very supposedly interconnected world, we don't often have a chance to engage with each other in a sector way when it comes to practice. So I saw that as an opportunity to say, well, hey, why don't we all get together and actually exchange practice, which then can affect change in your institutions if you find this useful. So people would come together like learning teams from different museums who had necessarily not met each other, or, or from different departments coming together for the first time. So I saw the network as an opportunity to, facilitate conversations that people wanted to have, but didn't otherwise have a chance to.
Thanks, JC. I love that notion of physical maps. Just my brain likes that way of managing that complex kind of picture and structure. So a last question from the audience here around teams and people, and you've all talked about people throughout this and the notion of people being with you, alongside you and your teams. And there's a question here from Lisa about how you've gone about recognising success and the journey you've been on with your teams, which feels really, really important. So Sarah, can we start with you?
Yeah, I've kind of got a big example and a smaller example, but we developed our new brand identity and vision. I talked about unity and joy through live music before. and that's come directly from the staff. When we worked on our brand, we had lots of staff briefings and brainstorming sessions, and one of the things that has happened now is that the voices of the staff are directly in the messaging that we're putting out. One of our box office managers said that the thing about us is that we are the best gig of your life every week, and that is directly in our brand messaging and has spread its tentacles across the organisation. So, and we're celebrating the success of the way that we work by embedding that the vision of that success directly into our brand values. And just on the smaller scale as well, when when we announced our new name, it was stressful. We'd come off furlough. We had to create we did it live stream. We've never done anything live stream before. After we pulled it together, I sent my team a thank you note in the post just to say thank you for, and I think that was just a little gesture of something personal to say thank you for your personal input in this. It's appreciated.
It's a really lovely human touch, really, and it's easy to forget those things sometimes. That's a lovely. Thank you, Sarah. JC, what about you?
Gosh, actually, that question's made me very emotional. It was a really remarkable time, actually, in many ways. And again, like Sarah, I suppose I'll give a small and a big. So in terms of the toolkit, because we collaboratively developed it and then had to use it immediately. So we had no idea how it was going to work. And the moment in which I felt that the toolkit was doing what it was supposed to do, one of the key parts of the toolkit was research questions that community members had about the collections, because it can be incredibly overwhelming to meet material cultural heritage, from your community that you've never met before, might not have known was there, and you want to get to know it again. So we'd worked, developed these set of questions, and I remember a community member, when we took evaluation on the toolkit, and I was asking, so how was it? And one of them said, those questions in the toolkit were brilliant. Who came up with those? And I was like, it was you. And I thought there was something about the process that meant that people had felt a part of it, but then had also let go of an outcome enough for it to belong to everybody else. And so that felt really, really positive. But I think in terms of an ongoing basis, the successes still keep happening. Whenever I see an email or I might see something online, that people who met through the project are now doing things together that I have nothing to do with. And that just brings me such joy. And it happens routinely, and just seeing all these connections that have been made. And yeah, the fact that it really doesn't have anything to do with me, because it was about them.
Can see that joy in your smile. It's lovely. James, what about you?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant question, actually, and I suppose I was just reflecting whether we do it enough still. So, but I mean, a couple of things. One is we've got this thing we call it Gossiping Success, actually, which we have at the start of all of our kind of exec meetings, and basically we go around and you basically gossip somebody who I will then write to, who's not in your team, is in another team, for something that they've done that goes the extra mile. And I think that's a really powerful thing. It's got into the DNA of the organisation. It's been really great over the last year. And the only thing I suppose is people are so constantly going the extra mile, you almost feel you can kind of never quite kind of capture that sort of effort that people have gone to. In practically speaking, we have this just now, actually over this summer, basically said that we will support team events for people to reconnect face to face. I mean, we're an organisation that operates all over the country, so people are used to not being always face to face. But our national office has been shut for 18 months, and we are doing that. Whether even though we're still in a financially very difficult context, we think the investment in that is valuable, and I think that's been welcomed. I suppose the other thing is taking advantage of the technology a bit. So I am you know, I've now been joining kind of regional meetings of all of my hostel managers across the country, for example, which before it would have been very different. I'd have to driven to all around the country to do it, whereas now they're on online like this, so it's easier for me to drop in, and I can thank people personally through that much more easily. I've got a one-to-one with all of my senior leadership team, so that's not just the people that report to me, but the next level down as well, and that's an opportunity just to talk personally to people, find out how it's been for them, and thank them personally. So it's a mix of, I think, all of those things, but it's a great question, and I think it's one we constantly need to remind ourselves of.
Lovely. I love that gossiping success. I think that's brilliant. I might take that as well. Lovely. Can I just ask one final thing, and just literally a couple of words or a sentence from each of you on this, but just in terms of, if you could offer one piece of advice, one top tip, if you like, to others about how to implement change well in their organisations, what would it be? What would it be? James, do you want to go first?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think I said it before, but I think staying true to your strategy and values as your orienting point through change, whatever that is.
Thank you. Sarah.
Yeah, I'm going to say something that I know colleagues at Inc. Arts talk about a lot, which is that shame never motivates anyone. You need to think about what the positives are. Where's the pleasure? Where's the future? Where's the happiness? Where's the joy?
Lovely, thank you. And JC?
Bring cake to that table.
I love that. Thank you. Thank you. That's a beautiful note to end on. Huge thank you from me to all of you for being with us and for listening this afternoon. I'm going to hand back to Vanessa in 1 second, but I'd just like to say a big thank you to Sarah, James and JC for your candidness, for your honesty, and for really reiterating the importance of values within that change process and holding those really true as well, because they can create the space for that change to happen too. So a huge thank you to all of you. I'm going to hand back to Vanessa now, who's just going to say some final words on behalf of Rebuilding Heritage.
A really brilliant session. Thank you, Amanda. And I'd just like to echo the thanks to JC, to Sarah and to James for sharing their experiences with us today. We've talked a lot on the Rebuilding Heritage programme about coping with change and managing change, and so it's just been great to finish off the programme with examples that are really about taking ownership instead, and finding ways of doing things even when we're feeling uncertain, finding ways of changing the way that we think about the challenges that are in front of us to instead feel much more positive emotions. I really didn't expect today for there to be so many mentions of joy, so that's just wonderful. And also from earlier in the session, I love those mentions of curiosity and awe. So it's great to hear about how we can change our thinking and find those different sources of confidence and different ways of drawing back to our values and our mission. So thank you all for sharing these thoughts and for closing the programme in a way that's truly inspirational. And finally, as this is the very last event in the series, I'd also like to say a general thank you to our audiences and our participants. We know many of you have been following us over the course of the past year and have engaged with us in lots of different ways and lots of different elements of the programme. So thank you to all of you as well. We hope that we've been able to provide you with some really useful support and guidance. And the final request then is to please look for those feedback forms that will be coming to you after the session. We'd really appreciate it if you would complete these forms, because it will help us to plan for future programmes, for future initiatives just like this. And finally, do remember to look out for our autumn knowledge sharing programme that will be coming in September and October. So that's it from me. Thank you once again to all of our panellists, and have a lovely evening, everyone.